Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his SUV, stretching his massive frame as he took in the quiet surroundings of the small roadside diner. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and asphalt, a stark contrast to the city lights and roaring crowds he was used to. He had spent the entire day at a charity event, shaking hands, taking pictures, and giving speeches. Now, all he wanted was a hot meal and a few minutes of peace before continuing his journey home. The diner's neon sign flickered slightly, casting a dull glow onto the mostly empty parking lot. It was the kind of place that had probably been around for decades, simple, unpretentious, and untouched by time. Inside, a handful of late-night customers sat in booths, nursing cups of coffee, lost in quiet conversations. The smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, reminding Shaq of the countless road trips he had taken in his early days as a player. He adjusted the red MAGA cap on his head as he stepped inside, barely paying attention to the way the fluorescent lights reflected off its bold letters. To him, it was just a hat, his choice, his statement, nothing more. He wasn't expecting anyone to care, let alone react. Sliding into a corner booth, he let out a long breath and glanced at the menu. A cheeseburger and fries. Simple. Easy. He waved down the waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes but a warm smile, and placed his order. She scribbled on her notepad, her gaze flickering briefly to the cap but saying nothing. Shaq appreciated that. For a moment, everything felt normal. The hum of the overhead lights, the distant clatter of silverware, the quiet murmur of patrons, it was the peaceful solitude he had been looking for. But it didn't last. From a nearby table, a group of men had begun whispering, their eyes repeatedly darting in his direction. At first, Shaq ignored it. He had dealt with stares all his life, fans recognizing him, people overwhelmed by his sheer size. But this wasn't admiration. It was something else, something more pointed. The whispers turned to low chuckles. Then a chair scraped against the floor as one of them stood up. He was wiry, with sharp, calculating eyes and a smirk that didn't reach them. He took slow, deliberate steps toward Shaq's booth, each one heavy with unspoken intent. "Hey, big guy," the man said, his voice laced with something that wasn't quite friendly. "That hat of yours, you really think you have the right to wear it around here?" Shaq lifted his gaze, calm but unyielding. He had seen this kind of confrontation before, the kind that started with words, but didn't always end that way. He set his menu down, his voice even. "It's my hat, my choice," he said simply. "This is a free country. If you don't like it, that's your problem." The man's smirk twisted into something darker, his posture shifting slightly, a challenge. And just like that, the quiet night Shaq had been hoping for was gone. The diner's atmosphere had shifted completely. What had once been a quiet roadside stop for travelers and locals had, in mere minutes, become a battleground of tension. The murmurs of casual conversation had vanished, replaced by a thick, stifling silence. Even the clinking of utensils against plates had ceased. Every pair of eyes in the diner was now glued to the unfolding confrontation between Shaquille O'Neal and the group of hostile bikers, who had clearly taken issue with his choice of headwear. Shaq stood tall, his massive frame unmoving, his face unreadable. He had faced countless opponents on the basketball court, towering over defenders who tried and failed to intimidate him. But this was different. This wasn't a game, and these men weren't trash-talking competitors looking for a highlight reel dunk. These were men looking for a fight. And while Shaq knew how to handle himself, he also knew that fights like these never ended well. Not for anyone. The leader of the bikers, a wiry man with a cocky smirk, leaned in closer. His breath reeked of beer, his fingers twitching slightly, as if itching for an excuse to turn this into something physical. "What's the matter, big guy?" he sneered, his voice carrying just enough mockery to make the other bikers chuckle. "You don't think your size is going to save you here, do you?" Another man, burlier, with arms covered in tattoos, cracked his knuckles. "Yeah," he added, his voice a low growl. "This ain't the court. No cameras, no referees, just us. So maybe you ought to think twice before throwing your weight around." Shaq didn't flinch. He had no interest in backing down, but he wasn't about to escalate things either. "I'm just here to eat," he said, his voice level but firm. "Same as everyone else." The leader scoffed, shaking his head. "Nah, see, that ain't how it works. You walk into our town wearing that hat, acting like you don't know what it means. You're making a statement whether you like it or not. Shaq sighed. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly why they had taken issue with him, but he also wasn't about to let a piece of fabric dictate who he was. It's a hat, he said simply. My hat, my choice. And this is a free country, right? The leader's smirk widened. Sure, free country. But freedom ain't free. Sometimes it comes at a cost. The tension in the air thickened. The waitress behind the counter had stopped moving entirely, her hands gripping the edge of the counter, as if bracing for what came next. A few of the other diners had already slipped out, sensing that things were heading in a dangerous direction. Chairs scraped against the wooden floor as more patrons tried to make quiet exits, hoping to avoid getting caught in whatever was about to unfold. Then, a voice cut through the building tension, calm, steady, yet carrying an undeniable authority. That's enough. The bikers turned, startled. From a corner booth near the back of the diner, a man rose to his feet. He wasn't large, not by any means, at least not compared to Shaq. But there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way his gaze didn't waver. His jacket, worn from years of use, bore an unmistakable patch on the sleeve, the emblem of the Navy SEALs. His sharp eyes, reflecting years of experience and resilience, locked onto the bikers. "What are you trying to do?" the man asked, his voice controlled but firm. "Harass a man over a hat? That's what you think makes you tough?" The leader of the bikers squared his shoulders, clearly thrown off by the interruption. "Mind your business, old man." The veteran took a step forward, placing himself between Shaq and the group. "Oh, but this is my business," he said, his tone never rising, but carrying a weight that silenced the entire room. "Because I fought for the right of every person in this country to wear what they want, believe what they want, and sit down to eat a damn meal in peace. And if you can't respect that, then you better be the ones walking out that door." A heavy silence fell over the diner. The bikers hesitated. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who wasn't throwing threats or fists, but instead standing firm in conviction alone. The leader clenched his jaw, shifting on his feet, glancing at his companions for some kind of support. But none of them spoke. The first man exhaled sharply, muttering something under his breath before turning toward the door. He shoved his hands into his pockets, his face twisting in frustration as he led the others out. One by one, they followed, though some cast lingering glances back at Shaq and the veteran, their pride clearly wounded. Shaq exhaled, unclenching his fists, realizing only then how tightly he had been holding them. He turned toward the man who had stepped in, the quiet veteran who had changed the course of the night with nothing more than his presence and his words. The man looked at Shaq and offered a small, almost amused smile. "Didn't think you needed help," he said. Shaq let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Wasn't about needing it," he replied, "but I sure as hell appreciate it." The man extended his hand. "Joe," he introduced himself simply. Shaq took it, his grip firm but respectful. "Shaquille, but everyone calls me Shaq." Joe nodded, glancing toward the empty seats where the bikers had been moments ago. "Didn't expect my coffee to come with a side of drama tonight," he said wryly. Shaq smirked. "Neither did I." As they sat down, the tension in the diner finally lifted. Conversations resumed, the waitress cautiously returned to her work, and the normal rhythm of the evening slowly crept back in. But Shaq knew that something had shifted. He had encountered all kinds of people in his life, but there was something about this man, this unassuming veteran, that felt different. And as their conversation unfolded, Shaq would soon realize that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have anticipated. The tension that had suffocated the diner slowly began to dissipate, but the weight of the confrontation still lingered in the air. Shaq remained seated across from Joe, the veteran who had stepped in without hesitation, diffusing a situation that could have easily spiraled out of control. There was something about the man, something in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself. He wasn't just another bystander who had seen trouble brewing, he was someone who had lived through battles far greater than a diner standoff. Shaq took a slow breath, letting the adrenaline settle, before glancing over at Joe, who now stirred his coffee with a deliberate calmness. "I appreciate what you did back there," Shaq said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Didn't have to step in, but you did." Joe shrugged slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't feel right just sitting there," he admitted. "Seen enough people try to push others around just because they think they can get away with it." He took a sip of his coffee, pausing for a moment before adding, "And I've seen enough fights to know that winning isn't always about who throws the first punch." Shaq nodded. He understood that better than most. Strength had never been just about size or power. It was about control, about knowing when to fight and when to stand firm without ever needing to lift a fist. Joe had understood that too, and that's what had made all the difference. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Shaq leaned forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. "You military?" he asked, already suspecting the answer. Joe glanced at him, then nodded. "Navy SEALs. A long time ago." Shaq raised an eyebrow, impressed but not surprised. "Makes sense," he said. "You carry yourself different. That wasn't just confidence back there, that was training." Joe let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "More like years of experience," he corrected. "I've seen enough to know that some fights aren't worth having. But when the right fight comes along, you don't hesitate." Shaq let the words settle, taking a moment to process them. He had met countless people in his lifetime, athletes, celebrities, businessmen, but few carried the kind of presence that Joe did. It wasn't loud or commanding in the way most powerful people tried to be. It was quiet, steady, the kind of presence that didn't need to prove anything because it had already been tested in ways most men would never understand. The waitress, who had been watching them cautiously, finally approached, a fresh pot of coffee in her hand. "On the house," she said softly, pouring a refill into both of their cups. "For what you did back there." Her voice was kind but carried a quiet shakiness, as if she was still recovering from the lingering tension. Joe gave her a small nod of thanks, and Shaq offered a grateful smile. "Appreciate it." As she walked away, Shaq turned back to Joe, studying him more closely. His worn-out jacket, his calloused hands, the slight limp when he had stood up, all signs of a man who had lived through more than he would ever openly admit. "You still in service?" Shaq asked. Joe shook his head. "No, been out for a while." He didn't elaborate, and Shaq didn't push, but there was something in his tone, a hint of something unspoken, that made it clear the transition from soldier to civilian hadn't been as smooth as it should have been. Shaq leaned back in his seat, letting out a small sigh. "Man, I don't get it," he said. "Guys like you, ones who've done more for this country than most ever will, should be taken care of. But instead, I meet vets all the time, struggling just to get by." Joe didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down carefully. "A lot of us don't like asking for help," he admitted. "You spend so many years learning how to handle things on your own, how to keep pushing forward no matter what. It's hard to let go of that." Shaq frowned. "That ain't right." Joe smirked slightly. "No, it's not, but it's reality." The weight of those words hung between them. Shaq, for all his success, for all his wealth and influence, knew that there were things in this world that money alone couldn't fix. But that didn't mean he couldn't do something about it. He glanced at Joe, who was watching him with a quiet patience, as if waiting to see what he would say next. Shaq drummed his fingers against the table, his mind racing. "Look, I know we just met, but—" He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I don't believe in just standing by when I see something wrong, and I sure as hell don't believe in letting good people struggle when I know I can help." Joe arched an eyebrow. "That's some kind of offer?" Shaq smirked. "More like an idea." Joe leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "All right," he said, curiosity flashing in his eyes. "Let's hear it." And in that moment, Shaq knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had expected. Joe sat across from Shaq, stirring his coffee in slow, deliberate circles. His eyes were tired but sharp, the kind that had seen things most people couldn't begin to imagine. Shaq had met plenty of tough men in his life, but there was something different about Joe. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence, the discipline, it was the weight he carried. A weight that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the kind of battles that never truly ended. Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You mentioned you were a Navy SEAL," he said, his voice even but curious. "That's no small thing." Joe gave a small nod, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug for just a second before he let out a breath. "Yeah, spent most of my life in the service, joined when I was young, thought I'd do my part, see the world, maybe even make a difference." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Funny how things don't always turn out the way you expect." Shaq didn't interrupt. He could tell Joe wasn't the kind of man who liked to talk about himself, and if he was opening up now, it was because something in him needed to be heard. Joe exhaled, staring at his coffee as if it held all the answers. "The thing about being in the military, especially in a unit like mine, is that it teaches you how to survive anything, how to push through pain, how to keep moving forward no matter what. But they don't teach you how to stop, how to come home and just be." He glanced up at Shaq, his expression unreadable. "One day, you're out there in the field, part of something bigger than yourself, every second has meaning. Then suddenly, it's over, and you're just another guy trying to figure out where you fit in." Shaq nodded slowly. He might not have been in the military, but he understood what it felt like to step away from something that had defined you for so long. Basketball had been his whole world, his identity, and when it ended, he'd had to find a new purpose. But he'd had resources, opportunities. Joe, and countless others like him, didn't always have that. Joe let out a quiet sigh. "After I left, I thought I'd figure it out. Got a job doing security, picked up mechanic work on the side. But then?" He hesitated, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a weight that had been sitting there too long. "Then my wife got sick." Shaq's chest tightened. He already knew where this was going, but he let Joe say it. "Linda," Joe continued, his voice quieter now, "the best woman I ever met. She stuck by me through everything. Through deployments, through the nights when I barely slept, through all the times I couldn't tell her what I'd seen, what I'd done. She never asked for much, just wanted us to build a life together." He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to steady himself. Then, out of nowhere, she was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 3. It hit fast, and it hit hard. Shaq's jaw clenched. He knew the devastation of losing people he loved, knew what it was like to feel helpless in the face of something he couldn't fight. Joe shook his head, his fingers tightening into a fist on the table. "I sold everything I could. Took every extra shift, worked myself to the bone to pay for her treatment. But it's never enough, man. You think serving your country means something, that it'll count for something when you need help the most. But when the bills pile up, when the insurance barely covers anything, you realize real fast that all the medals and honors in the world don't mean a damn thing when the system is broken." Shaq inhaled deeply, his mind racing. He'd heard stories like this before too many times. Veterans who had given everything, only to be left with nothing when they needed help. But this wasn't just a story. This was the man sitting right in front of him. Joe let out a breath, rubbing his temples. "She's in the hospital now. Small place, barely has the equipment she needs. The doctors do what they can, but the reality is, if I can't keep up with the payments, they'll have to stop her treatment." He swallowed hard, his voice lowering. "And if that happens, I lose her." Silence settled over them, thick and heavy. Shaq felt something deep in his chest, something beyond anger, beyond frustration. It was the kind of helplessness he hated more than anything, the knowledge that good people were suffering, and the ones who should have been taking care of them weren't. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on Joe's. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low but filled with certainty. Joe looked at him, a flicker of something in his expression. Doubt? Hope? He wasn't sure. Shaq exhaled, his decision already made. "I want to meet Linda. I want to see for myself what's going on." Joe hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting help, but something about Shaq, the way he said it not like a pity offer, but like a man who was about to do something real, made him nod. "All right," Joe said quietly. "Let's go." And just like that, Shaq knew this wasn't just about one meal in a roadside diner. This was the beginning of something much bigger. Joe led Shaq through the dimly lit hospital corridors, his footsteps slow but steady. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, and the faint beeping of heart monitors echoed from nearby rooms. Shaq had been in plenty of places where pain lingered in the walls, locker rooms after crushing defeats, neighborhoods where kids struggled just to have a chance. But this was different. This wasn't just about struggle. This was about survival. They reached a small room near the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and through it, Shaq caught his first glimpse of Linda. She was lying in bed, her frame frail beneath the thin hospital sheets. The fluorescent light above cast a soft glow on her face, and even though she looked exhausted, she still managed a small smile when she saw Joe enter. Her eyes flickered to Shaq, widening slightly. Joe walked up to her bedside and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her fragile skin. "Linda, I brought someone to meet you," he said quietly. Shaq stepped forward, his size almost overwhelming in the small space. He softened his stance, lowering himself so he wasn't towering over her. "Hey, Mrs. Linda," he said, offering a warm smile. "Joe's been telling me all about you." Linda chuckled softly, though it was weak. "I hope he left out the embarrassing parts." Joe smirked, shaking his head. "No promises." Shaq glanced around the room. It was bare, no flowers, no family pictures, just a single chair and a few worn-down medical devices. The hospital itself looked like it had seen better days. He'd been in state-of-the-art facilities before, places where money wasn't an issue. But here, every crack in the walls, every outdated machine, told the same story. This hospital was running on hope more than anything else. Linda shifted slightly, her smile fading as she studied Shaq. "Joe tells me you're trying to help," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I appreciate it, but we've been managing. We always do." Joe's jaw clenched slightly. "Barely," he muttered. Linda squeezed his hand. "Joe." Shaq watched the exchange, seeing the years of love, of partnership, of fighting side by side, even when the odds were against them. He exhaled, leaning forward slightly. "I get it," he said. "You're used to handling things on your own. You've been fighting your whole life. But sometimes, even the strongest people need a hand." He gestured around the room. This isn't right. You shouldn't have to struggle like this. Not after everything." Linda studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "We didn't plan for this. You never think about what happens when life throws something at you that you can't fight off. Joe, he's been working himself into the ground trying to keep up. And I see it eating away at him." Her voice wavered slightly, but she steadied herself. "But what choice do we have?" Shaq's hands curled into fists at his sides. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't a doctor, but damn it, he wasn't going to stand by and do nothing. "You have one now," he said firmly. Joe looked at him, his expression unreadable. "What are you saying, Shaq?" Shaq met his gaze. "I'm saying this ends now. The stress, the sleepless nights, the worry about money, it stops today. I'll cover the rest of Linda's treatments, and I'll make sure this hospital gets the funding it needs." Joe's breath caught. Linda's eyes widened. "Shaq, we can't." "You can," Shaq interrupted, his voice low but resolute. "And you will. This isn't charity. This is what should have been done in the first place. You fought for this country, Joe. You sacrificed for it. And Linda? She's been fighting her own war. You both deserve better." Joe's shoulders slumped, the weight he had been carrying for years suddenly feeling a little lighter. His fingers tightened around Linda's hand as he swallowed hard. "I don't even know what to say." Shaq nodded toward Linda. "Then don't say anything. Just focus on getting her better." A few seconds of silence passed, thick with emotion. Then Linda's lips trembled, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. Shaq reached out, placing a large, gentle hand over theirs. "You're not alone anymore," he said, "and we're just getting started." Shaq left the hospital that night with a heavy heart. But there was something else simmering beneath the weight of what he had just witnessed: determination. He had spent his life using his strength to dominate the basketball court, but now he realized there was a different kind of strength, one that had nothing to do with muscle or height. It was the strength to change lives, to stand up when no one else would, to fix what had been broken for far too long. The next morning, before the sun had even fully risen, Shaq was already making calls. He didn't waste time second-guessing. He knew what needed to be done. He reached out to doctors, hospital administrators, business leaders, and philanthropists, anyone who had the power to make an impact. But this wasn't just about finding money. This was about creating something bigger, something that wouldn't just help Linda but would ensure that no one else had to suffer in silence like she had. By noon, he was sitting in a high-rise office in the heart of the city, surrounded by his closest advisors. His team had seen him work on charity projects before, but there was something different in his eyes today, an unshakable resolve. "I need your help," Shaq said, his deep voice steady, commanding. "I want to do something big, something that lasts. We're not just covering Linda's hospital bills, we're fixing the system that let her fall through the cracks in the first place." His advisors exchanged glances. One of them, a financial strategist, leaned forward. "Shaq, you've donated millions before. You've helped build schools, sponsored charities. This isn't just about writing a check," Shaq interrupted. "This is about real change. I don't want a quick fix. I want to build something that'll outlive me." A hush settled over the room. Then another voice spoke up, this time from one of his longtime business partners. "What are you thinking?" Shaq exhaled slowly, organizing his thoughts before he spoke. "A foundation," he said. "Not just any foundation. One that focuses on helping people who can't afford medical treatment. But more than that, I want to renovate hospitals and communities like Joe's, where people don't have access to the care they need." Another advisor, a public relations specialist, nodded slowly. "That's a big mission." Shaq's eyes darkened with conviction. "Good. Big missions change the world." From that moment on, the plan was set into motion. Calls were made, meetings were scheduled, and within days, Shaq's vision began taking shape. He personally met with hospital directors, learning firsthand where funding was needed most. He connected with medical supply companies, negotiating donations of state-of-the-art equipment. And he reached out to his fellow athletes, urging them to use their platforms to bring attention to the crisis in healthcare accessibility. Then, a week later, Shaq returned to Joe's town, but this time he didn't come alone. A convoy of trucks rolled into the small hospital parking lot, carrying brand new medical equipment, an advanced X-ray machine, chemotherapy devices, and even new hospital beds. Doctors and nurses rushed outside, their eyes wide with disbelief as they watched crates of supplies being unloaded. Joe stood at the entrance, his expression unreadable as Shaq approached. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Shaq grinned. "It's just the start." Joe glanced at the trucks, at the workers carrying equipment inside, at the sheer scale of what was happening. He swallowed hard. "Shaq, I don't know what to say." Shaq clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then don't say anything. Just know that you and Linda are never going to have to fight this battle alone again." As Joe watched the transformation unfold before his eyes, he realized something. This wasn't just about him or Linda anymore. This was about the hundreds, maybe thousands of families who would never have to go through what they had. Because one man had seen their struggle and refused to look away. And for the first time in years, Joe felt something he thought he had lost: hope. A year had passed since Shaq first walked into that diner, unknowingly stepping into a moment that would redefine his purpose. What started as a simple meal had turned into something much bigger: a movement, a mission, a legacy that would outlast him. The Hope Beyond Hoops Foundation had grown far beyond what he had imagined. Hospitals and struggling communities had been renovated, thousands of patients had received life-saving treatment, and scholarships had been granted to students who once thought their dreams were out of reach. But more than the money, more than the resources, Shaq had reignited something even more powerful: compassion. People who had once felt disconnected from the struggles of others were now stepping forward, donating, volunteering, and becoming part of something greater than themselves. Athletes, celebrities, and everyday citizens alike had been inspired by what he had started, proving that change wasn't just about wealth or fame, it was about choosing to act when others ignored the call. One day, Shaq found himself standing in front of the first hospital his foundation had helped rebuild. The words "Hope Beyond Hoops, where miracles begin" gleamed under the afternoon. Joe turned to Shaq, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save Linda, you saved me. You saved this community." Shaq shook his head, smiling warmly. "Nah, Joe, you saved yourself a long time ago. You just needed someone to remind you that the world still had your back." Nearby, a little girl ran up to Shaq, clutching a crayon drawing of a giant man with a Thank you, Shaq looked up at the clear blue sky, feeling so. Sometimes changing the world doesn't take extraordinary strength, just a heart willing to share. If this story touched your heart, comment 1. If you think we can improve, comment 2. And if you want to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.